Helen Keller. Helen Keller was a little American girl. She was born in 1880 in Alabama. When she was 19 months old, she became very ill, and after her illness, her parents found that she was blind. She was also quite deaf, and she couldn't learn to speak because she wasn't able to hear other people's voices. For 5 years, the little girl lived in a dark and silent world. She was able to feel with her hands, and she knew that other people moved their mouth to talk. She moved her mouth too, but she didn't know how to speak like other people, and it made her sad. Often, she cried and shouted with anger because she couldn't make people understand her. Helen's father and mother didn't know how to help their little girl. She was a clever child, but how could they help her to learn? She had to learn everything by feel and touch, and they didn't know how to teach her. When Helen was nearly 6 years old, her father was told about a clever teacher called Anne Sullivan. She had learned how to teach blind and deaf children. She taught them to spell words on their hands, and to understand what people were saying by touching their face and mouth when they spoke. Miss Sullivan came to live with the Kellers. At first, she could not make Helen understand. She took the little girl round the room and made her touch things. She touched a chair, and then she took Helen's hand and spelled the letters of the word chair in the deafened language. Then she touched a table and spelled its letters in Helen's hand. But Helen didn't understand that Miss Sullivan was making words for her. Then one day, Miss Sullivan took her in the garden. There was a well in the garden, and Miss Sullivan put Helen's hand in the cold water. Then she spelled the word water into Helen's hand, and suddenly Helen understood. Miss Sullivan was teaching her the name for this cold, with something on her hand. Helen spelled the word water again, and laughed and cried with happiness. She ran all round the garden asking the names of everything. She touched a flower and made Miss Sullivan spell flower into her hand. She touched everything in the garden, and then ran into the house and touched other things. She learned to spell 30 words that day. Some of the words were mother, father, sister, teacher, door, baby, open, shut, go, come. After this, Helen learned very quickly. She learned many new words every day, and was always asking questions. She was soon able to write and also to read from books specially made for the blind people. Then, when she was 9 years old, she learned to speak. One day, she spelled into Miss Sullivan's hand.
How do blind girls know what to say with their mouth? Can deaf children learn to speak? Please teach me to talk.
And Miss Sullivan taught her. Helen touched Miss Sullivan's face and mouth when Miss Sullivan spoke. Then she touched her own face and mouth and said the same word. It was very hard work, but at last, she learned how to talk like other people. She was a very brave and clever girl. When she was 16 years old, Helen knew how to speak 5 languages, and when she was 20, she went to college. After graduating at the age of 24, she became a lecturer and a writer and raised money for the blind and deaf. She died in 1968, at the age of 88. She had written many books. One day, you must read her book called The Story of My Life.